slice these off just to make sure we are good.
So you do this as a Hangout? Is that what it is?
Yeah, we use Google Hangouts for this. Pretty good infrastructure. You know, Google's got those tied to.
Yeah.
Really wish Link would work. Link or Skype would get better in this way.
Yeah.
We've been talking with those teams. We've been, you know, as we've podcasted for the last 5 years, we've been big. I mean, we started on Skype, and we've been big Skype users. For audio, there's still nothing better, right, than Skype.
But for integration, if you're going to publish to YouTube.
Oh, it's so easy, so slick, and they just make it so easy. So okay, let me get started. We are here at Infotech. I'm sorry, not Infotech. That was the last conference that I did. Let me try it again. We're here at the Heartland Developer Conference in the fall of 2014. I'm here with Pete Brown. He's works for Microsoft and the keynote speaker this morning. Pete, thanks for taking a few minutes to be with us.
Well, thanks for having me here.
Good to have you. Tell us a little bit about your role at Microsoft, what you do, or what they pay you to do, and then maybe what you do that they don't pay you to do.
Right. So luckily, what I get paid to do is what I love to do.
Oh,
so
good.
They tend to work out really well. I focus on a few different areas at Microsoft. I work a lot with XAML and .NET teams. I've had a lot of experience with them over the years and supporting WPF in the community and just XAML and everything. Then I have worked with creative apps and technologies for musicians. So again, another area that I love to work with. So working with the creative audio teams and being able to work with actual musicians out there, some of which have been fairly famous, so it's been pretty exciting.
Yeah, very cool.
And then the third thing, which was the subject of what I talked about today, is IoT. So I work closely with the Internet of Things team, primarily the client side. We have other folks that I work with that do a lot more on the server side and the services side and stuff as well. So really fun stuff.
Very cool. Let's kind of take those in order because I've got questions for you on all three of those areas. One, let's talk a little bit about .NET and with Microsoft. A couple years ago, as an IT professional, I kind of thought .NET would be slowly going away, and in the last 3 or 4 years, it has really made a resurgence in the developers community. What's going on at Microsoft around that framework? What are you guys excited about for the future? If I'm a .NET developer, what do I have to look forward to?
I think some of the most exciting things in .NET are the additional devices that you're going to be able to target with that. So right now we have the ability to use .NET on phones and on desktop. In the future, we're going to have .NET and some of the universal app stuff. So also JavaScript and C++ for people who like that on some of the IoT devices as well. So I think for me that's the most exciting thing. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the .NET world that's just a refinement of what we've had before, trimming things down and making sure that it performs better and everything. But for me, the real big thing coming up is more places where I can target that code.
And the importance of Visual Studio then going forward.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I cracked a joke about it this morning where as somebody who works in IoT type stuff and who's done a lot with microcontrollers of all different sorts, I've had to use Eclipse and stuff in the past. And some people live and die by Eclipse. It's not my favorite IDE. So for me, anything I can do inside Visual Studio is a huge boon for me.
Yeah.
And I showed today demoing, deploying to the Intel Galileo a small Arduino type board from Visual Studio. So again, very, very important part of what we're doing.
Yeah. So as we see future versions of Visual Studio, what's kind of Microsoft's focus on the future with? Is it Visual Studio everywhere? Is that kind of the, you can develop on anything in any place using Visual Studio?
Well, I'm not going to speculate there.
Sure.
Not my primary focus. But as a happy user of that, I would certainly love to see Visual Studio in more places. I think some of the stuff that we've done on the Azure side for making it so that you can do more things from any device to work with Azure will certainly help there. And then a lot of the TFS stuff that we've done, making that accessible on the web, I think is a big deal. The big question is, will we make it so the compilers and the IDE work on non-Windows devices? Hard to tell. Satya is very into supporting lots of different platforms and lots of devices, so I certainly wouldn't rule it off the table.
It's been interesting to see the change there at Microsoft, and now it's Windows or it's Office everywhere. We want it on everything and on every platform. And that's been great. From an enthusiast's perspective, from an MVP perspective, it's been great for us to see that, see those changes.
The change has been a really big deal. I mean, it's really nice to have the pressure of requiring everything to be Windows first kind of pulled back a little bit. I mean, Windows is still very, very important to us, but we can support Android and we can support iOS, and we don't have to be just about Windows, right? I mean, the cloud services and Clearly, a lot of the IoT stuff is not really Windows centric, but you know, we want to make sure you have the best experience for Visual Studio and for developing on Windows, but we want to make sure we support as many places as possible.
Let's talk a little bit about that, especially with Internet of Things. There's some interesting things going on at Microsoft as far as embedding what used to be Windows embedded, and now we've got Windows getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Talk a little bit about maybe your focus or what you're seeing when we talk about these smaller devices. What's Microsoft doing in that space with the OS?
Sure. We have a pretty broad array of things that have been traditional embedded that we're now kind of rebranded as Internet of Things. You have Windows Embedded Industry, which is really at the top end. It's essentially Windows 8.1 that you can use on an embedded device. And there's some interesting things going on there, where we just announced support for the Minnow Board Max, which is a board about, for people listening, it's about the size of a deck of cards. For the rest of you, it's like that, right? Oh yes, there we go.
There we go.
I'm looking at, it's not really showing it to the computer. It's not going to help.
No, it's good.
So it's a small board, but it's got an Intel Atom processor on it, 64-bit. It's essentially a tablet this size, right?
Yeah.
That can run Windows embedded, and it can be very hacker-friendly as well as very, for people who are building drivers. Then if you go all the way down, we have Windows CE and a bunch of other stuff in the middle. And then we have the Windows on Devices program, which is brand new. It's something that we announced in April, and we just started deploying. And that's right now, just the Intel Galileo, which is that Quark processor that I talked about. Essentially a Pentium class from way back when Pentium was first introduced. But they've shrunk the die way down. They've lowered the power requirements. They've done all the things they need to do to make it a pretty decent contender in the IoT space. It's an enthusiast board right now, and we're far from done in what we can do on that. But we've managed to shrink Windows down, so it'll run on there with something like a 40 meg footprint, just on real basic. Like, we haven't even optimized it at this point. But being able to run Windows on that and write Win32 code, as well as use our open source implementation of the wiring libraries. So we've got those out on GitHub so that you can write Arduino type code and use a lot of Arduino code as is and run it directly on that device. So we've done a lot there. But as I sort of mentioned originally, our ultimate goal with those, as to be determined if this happens on the Galileo itself, there are some technical challenges there. But our ultimate goal with Windows on Devices is to be able to let you run universal apps, so that if you're a .NET developer or a JavaScript developer or a C++ developer, that same type of code that you can write to run on a phone or run on a desktop will run on these tiny devices as well. And I think that's where our real value with Visual Studio and with the skill set and everything all comes into play. Same thing all the way down.
You mentioned Universal Apps a couple times. For anybody who doesn't know what that is from Microsoft, talk a little bit about Universal Apps.
So, when we introduced Windows 8, we introduced the idea of Windows Store Apps, WinRT. But we had a real disconnect between big Windows and Windows Phone at the time. And you had to write separate apps for both different languages and stuff. And we started to converge those things together. And we've been doing the same thing with Xbox, where the Xbox One is running essentially a version of Windows 8 on it. In the next version of Windows, we're pulling all these things together to make sure that you can run them. They're all running the same operating system, and the same apps run across all of those. At Build in April, we announced the idea of a universal app. And a universal app is something that you write in Visual Studio that'll run across all of these different devices. So it's, again, HTML and JavaScript, C++, which can be with either DirectX or XAML, and then .NET, which C# or Visual Basic, and also using all WinRT. Those that technology, what we used to call Windows Store Apps, because we've made it so that they will run across anything, we now call universal apps. And you'll still optimize user interface for different platforms and whatnot. Sure. Yeah. Okay. That's the Universal Apps platform that's coming. Yeah. It's here, right?
Yeah.
We're at 90-some-odd% API convergence right now. Okay. If you want to do a universal app that runs across Windows and Windows Phone, Xbox isn't part of it just yet. It will get there. And then same thing with our Windows for Devices is not there, but it will get there.
It's coming though. I mean, we're starting to see, especially on the Windows Phone side, we're seeing a lot of changes go on there.
Yeah.
It's been fun to watch even Windows change, Windows 8, Windows 8.1, and now with the new update, kind of really go through a metamorphosis very, very quickly. Excited to see some of the quick iterations that are coming out of Microsoft.
And the next version will be even better. We showed some preview screenshots of that at Build where we realized we how to put this delicately. We maybe missed the goal on the desktop, right?
Well,
where
it was an idea.
we kind of over-optimized for tablets.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I mean, tablets are really the future
Sure.
for a lot of people in touchscreen laptops. But nevertheless, we have a lot of desktop users. I'm one of them.
Yeah.
When I'm at home, I'm on the desktop all the time. And we made it more difficult than necessary to do that, and so we're going to fix that.
We're getting some feedback from the community. We've heard that too, and as people said, "Oh, I don't know about Windows 8," I'm like, "No, try it with the new updates on it. It's a lot like your old Windows 7 box, but better." And a lot of people have said, "Oh yeah, hey, actually, this is really workable."
So the 8.1 update 1 is a huge improvement.
Yeah.
But the big thing that we're still missing is a start menu that people will be familiar with.
Sure.
So the intent in the next version of Windows is, let's make it really comfortable so that people who are moving from Windows 7 find really compelling reasons to move here and are really comfortable.
Sure.
And then, of course, Windows 8 and Windows 8.1 users as well.
And are you referring to Threshold then, that version?
I'm not going to confirm any code names, but yeah. All right. So.
All right. Yeah. You don't have to. Let's move on to some Internet of Things conversation. You had some gadgets up there. What are you excited about in this space? I mean, there's a ton when Raspberry Pi was kind of, well, Arduino was really the first one out the door. Raspberry Pi came along, got popular. I'm starting to see these companies come up with these little gadgets that you can do stuff with. What are you excited about?
So I really like the Raspberry Pi.
Okay.
So I think that's a really cool device. I'm not really a Linux user. I mean, I can find my way around. I used to run Linux firewalls. I ran some of the original versions of Linux back when I was part of Boston Computer Society and went to their show and stuff way back in the day. But it's not really my thing. It's the different tool chain, all sorts of stuff, right? So I do tend to be more excited about what we're doing on the Windows side of things, just because that's where I'm really comfortable. So if I had to look at two different places that, let me say 3 different places that really have me excited there.
Yeah.
Starting at the low end, one, I love that we're reinvesting in the .NET micro framework, because all the stuff that's happened with Netwino and stuff GHI has done and everything, there was a lot of concern from the community that we're just sort of throwing that aside. We moved that team over into the IoT team, so they're now officially part of the embedded group. They're no longer this sort of weird little part off of .NET, off the .NET group. So having them there and knowing that we're investing in them and that we'll have announcements to make soon on that, that's really exciting to me, because I love working with Chris Walker and the Netwino guys. He does some really cool stuff there. The second thing is I really like what we're doing on Windows on devices. So it's the idea that we can show people that you can get Windows down really tight, because Windows does not have your reputation for being a lean and mean operating system.
Not always, no.
So it's never, bloated is a term that you hear in the community a lot and stuff. But being able to show that, hey, there's a lot of optional stuff in Windows, but if you really kind of tighten it down, we can get it to run on these relatively small devices. Not as low power as a Raspberry Pi or something yet. Could get there,
sure,
but certainly something that's really low power that you can run with it. So that's exciting to me, because then I can still use Visual Studio. All my command line stuff that I'm used to doing all works the same way. You'll be able to do .NET. Matter of fact, I was able to get a simple .NET program running on there, even though it's not officially supported yet, because when we moved the stuff over, we left the CLR on there, just not any of the base class libraries. Right? The third thing is, I work very closely with a different hardware team inside Microsoft called Sigma, Silicon Graphics and Media, which related to this. And they've been releasing development boards. And the first one that we released was the Intel Sharks Cove, which was a board about this big, paperback book roughly size, right?
Sure.
For people who still read paperback books as opposed
half a sheet
to
of
small
paper,
Kindle
maybe.
size,
Yeah,
something like that, right?
Yeah.
So they have released that board as a board for driver developers and companies that are looking to create hardware for Windows. Because in the past, they had to go through a really kind of special process to get their own development board, which could cost $1,500 or something like that. They had to buy Visual Studio, the full MSDN subscription or Pro, which was expensive. They had to sign an NDA and whatnot. So I've been working with those guys, and throughout the past year and a half, to help target this community, we've made sure that, one, the boards are relatively inexpensive. You can get them from places like Mouser, so you don't have to go through any special channels. None of that request a quote crap, which
you
you
can't find them, and so you got to find them on eBay, and the prices are jacked up for those kinds of things.
And then we made it so you can use a free edition of Visual Studio with that. So we've lowered all those barriers. As a result of that, it's not just good for the hardware guys, that the companies that are doing this, but that instantly starts making these things accessible to makers and hackers.
Mm-hmm.
Where the Shark Scope is a $300 board. It's not cheap by any
Sure.
stretch in that community. But the Middleboard Max, which we just announced support for, is $100. And that's essentially a tablet, 64-bit Atom processor on it. So if you're the kind of person that would have put a tablet on a robot,
Sure.
which they do in university quite a bit,
Right.
being able to take this small credit card sized device, put it on there, and be able to run full Windows embedded on it is pretty huge.
Yeah.
So those are, outside the music stuff, those are in the embedded space what really excites me.
Yeah, no, and there's some amazing. This is a great time to be alive. There's just some amazing things coming out that are really working. That really work in our favor, especially in the tablet space and productivity space. How important then is C++ in all? For a while, it seemed like even on the enterprise space that was going away. It seems to be making, or at least coming back. Is that going to get more important?
So it's like most languages, ebb and flow a bit.
Yeah.
C++ has always been really important in any kind of high performance apps. So most of the music apps that I work with, all C++.
Okay.
Like, some actually are Delphi, believe it or not, but other ones are all C++. If you're going to write something like Cubase, you're going to write it in native code.
Sure.
Games, generally all C++, the serious games, right?
Yeah.
So they've always been important there, and they'll continue to be important there. But microcontrollers and embedded devices, because of the nature of the size of the code that you can put on there and everything, they've always been either assembly, C, or C++ for the vast majority of them. And so there's a lot of focus on C++ on those devices as well. And so I think you'll see a big resurgence on that side. If we're talking 200 billion devices in the next 5 years or something like that.
Right.
That's a lot of C++ code.
Yeah.
We're trying to make it so that's not your only choice.
Right.
But if you want to run .NET or WinRT or something, you're not going to do that on the very smallest 8-bit hardware. You need a little bit more processing power for that.
Interesting. Yeah. No, it's another. Hearing a lot of that in the industry kind of come back, and where that wasn't going very far, it seemed before. Let's wrap this up a little bit with your music side, because this is interesting. I know you're a Surface guy. I saw the Surface, and then when you're coming out, we had seen some. I'd seen some music apps or some things coming up with the Surface, maybe last year.
Yep.
We making any progress on some of those things, or what are you excited about in that arena?
So we are. Probably a lot of what you saw was something I was involved in, which is good. I worked a lot with ImageLine to bring things like FL Studio Groove, and worked with Jordan Rudis to bring over MorphWiz and some things like that. But then we kind of lost steam a little bit, and the reason is we have, quite honestly, some latency issues in the audio stack on our platform. So one thing that I'm really excited with is I've been working with what we have now is called the Creative Audio team. We also have the Creative Video team that does similar stuff. I've been able to work with them, bringing in lots of different partners, and over the past year we have had calls with probably all the I don't want to say all, because somebody's going to be listening saying they didn't call me.
You'll be fine.
Many of the major hardware and software companies involved in the music business.
Yeah.
And they've just been excited that we're even talking to them at this point. They're like, wow, you guys ignored us forever. Thank you for talking to us.
Yeah.
And we said, hey, what's your latency requirement? What do you really need in the platform? And we're trying to do our best in the next version of Windows to address as many of those as possible. One of the first things that we did at Build is Jason and I introduced the new WinRT MIDI API, which is a MIDI API for connecting musical instruments and synthesizers and stuff to something like a Surface. So we made sure that was our first thing. It was a Windows API released via NuGet, so that was a real experience for the Windows team. They'd never done that before. And so we worked through that and able to get that out. And then we're just doing more leading up to the next version of Windows. And at the same time, I've been talking to companies about building apps, what can we build for the next version. And it's my hope that we'll have some really cool stuff come lunchtime for the next version.
Well, I think a Surface makes a great podcasting device in a lot of ways. We've let's talk real quick about Surface.
Let me have one
go
more
ahead.
thing.
Yeah.
So I have a Surface Pro 3, which I got, which is really, if you're somebody who's doing musician type stuff, it's really the thing that we offer that's probably the best thing for you, because most serious music apps are desktop apps, and then as we do more on the touch side and the tablet side, it has both, right? And I'm going to be speaking as a Microsoft representative at an event in Boston at the end of this month called A3 Exchange, and they have several panels which are music app developer focused, and we'll be there. So I think just the fact that Microsoft is having representation at some of these events, and that they're interested in hearing about Surface and interested in hearing about what we're doing, is in itself an improvement over what we had before.
Yeah, no, it's exciting, and I love what's going on with Surface. There's been a couple versions that's come out. We've seen the Core i3 now, Core i5, Core i7. Have you experienced any of those platforms across? I mean, have you used all three of them for what you're doing? Is there any better? Seems like that Core i5 is the sweet spot on the Surface. What's been your experience?
I have an i7. A i7 256 with 8 gigs of memory, which quite honestly has turned out to be a bit of overkill. I really think the i5 256 gig for people who are doing creative work, like I do Photoshop and stuff on there, as well as all the music apps. The i5 I think is really the sweet spot there. It's quite a bit less. I think it's a few $100s less. i5 is going to run cooler than an i7, so your fan's going to turn on less often.
They run pretty hot. We know that for sure.
When you crank the CPU, I mean that's an i5 or an i7. That's not an Atom processor. Not an ARM processor in there.
It gets pretty warm, those boxes. And it's such tight. I mean, the milling on that is so tight. You're almost touching the CPU.
Right. I mean, and they have the magnesium case, and that is itself the heatsink. So, think about it. Like, I have an overclocked desktop, and I can tell you that runs hot, right? But this one, the fact that they were able to get that level of Intel processor inside something that thin and have it run without like melting is actually impressive to me. Now I did see some early reports of some temperature issues online and stuff. I know there have been a bunch of firmware updates that have helped fix that. I've never had it shut down due to temperature. I've had it get pretty toasty when I was doing some serious work, but so far it's handled it pretty well.
Yeah, no, very good. And I think I'd lean towards the Core i3 version of that, but it's just one of those things that I had a Surface 2, I had the RT version of Surface.
I have that as well.
And my daughter loved it so much, she begged me for it, and I gave it to her, and she's just loving it.
The i3 is a good processor, right? So if you're not doing the type of work that we're talking about doing, or encoding video and stuff, the i3 is a really good step up from something like an Atom, where you've got a real x86 processor that can do pretty much anything else that you would want to throw at it.
Well, we finally, that sounds critical, but we finally got the pen working right. And on Surface 3, that pen is just dynamite, and it writes like butter. I mean, it's just incredible how good that is. So
OneNote is the killer app there. So I use it all the time now.
It's pretty good, and we go back and forth. We used, we started before OneNote really went live, so to speak. We used a lot of Google Docs for that. But I've been going back and forth. A lot of my work stuff is kept in OneNote, and I'm able to share that. And it's been a great, whatever emphasis they put on it at Microsoft, they've done some amazing work from the OneNote
I use
team.
it so I'll enter notes on my desktop, and then it's available on my phone. So I use it for even silly little things like shopping lists and remind me to get
to-do lists are great for that. It syncs, and for some of the work podcast stuff that we do, I keep all our podcast notes in there, and so I can get to them from anywhere. We're going to podcast live, so I'll podcast live for Gallup Friday from here, and I don't have to worry about that, right? Just bring it up, and it'll work just fine. Pete, any last thoughts? Anything you said in there that you'd want to tell somebody as far as what's coming up at Microsoft?
So just a little thing in general. So one of the themes and one of the that I tried to get across today was the idea of bringing your kids into this technology more. So making sure that you encourage them to be makers, and that it's not just about kind of boring coding, but you need to find what I said there, Commodore 64. So I'm 40 some odd years old. For me, it was a Commodore 64 that got me into it at the time. For kids today, it's these little devices where they can just go and blink LEDs and build robots and stuff. Or it's something like Little Bits, or it's something like Raspberry Pi or whatever. Find their thing that's really interesting to them, so that you can encourage them to be in this industry and do really cool stuff, as opposed to just the grind of, because we know there's always a grind aspect of the coding. So encouraging them to get past that and do all the really fun stuff.
So Jody and I run a high school internship program for Gallup, and we are trying to get high schoolers excited about software development. I've thought in this maker movement that we're having, as well as things have gotten smaller, but what advice would you give me as I'm running I got high schoolers. We want to teach them software development, but from what you've seen, if I were to bring one program in to have them monkey with something, what would you recommend?
Oh boy, what program would I recommend? So for a high school level, so from a selfish aspect, I would love to see some of the Windows on Devices stuff go on there. It's not quite ready yet for that, so it's sort of like
so I should keep my eye on it.
So I do think that's keeping your eye on it. And at the same time, letting them know that at Microsoft we're actually doing stuff here. Like I had the same issue with musicians I spoke with where they thought, oh, we didn't know you could make music on Windows. We're really bad about getting the message of creativity on Windows out. So I mean, being able to do some really cool things there would be really good. The Little Bit stuff targets a younger group, I think, less so than high school, although there's some high school thing there.
Although I know some adults who like it.
Yeah, it's certainly one of them. So I think there is some play there. But really, I would focus on, right now, Arduino, Raspberry Pi, and those types of things, because that is where they're going to get the most bang for the buck. But again, I would encourage them to look at the full spectrum of what's out there, not just from us, but also just from other companies, where so they can realize what all those devices are, what they can use to target them, what the different coding environments are. And because this is high school, expose them to as diverse a group of technology as possible, because they're still making up their mind as to what they like. Where if you focus on only one thing, you've probably kind of hamstrung them a bit, so that when they get into college, like, well, I only know Android, I only know iOS, or whatever things that they're going to be coding in. They're at that age where they can learn pretty much anything.
Yeah, we made it through this whole interview. We never even talked about Azure. So there's lots of exciting things coming out on that platform as well, right?
Yeah, I mentioned the IoT group. I work mostly with the client side, but there's a whole group of people that work on services, that are building services for connecting all these devices, and it's all built on Azure and very closely with the Azure team. And as you can imagine, especially with Satya as CEO right now, Azure is more important than ever. And it's become our it's become our kind of our big thing inside the company. So here's an example of where these fit in. There's a company in the UK that builds synthesizers, really nice ones. Like they cost about $5,200 US, right? They have embedded in that a small computer. I'm not going to say what it runs or anything like that.
Sure.
But they have a small computer embedded inside that, and it has a web server built in, and you can remotely manage it and whatnot. But they also have a cloud service. This is a cloud-connected synthesizer. They have a cloud service that they can use to transfer patches, to collaborate, do all sorts of cool things. So the whole idea of cloud-connected devices, and technically that's kind of an IoT thing, right?
Yeah, very much so.
The idea of these cloud-connected devices is it's much more than just running your typical data center server up in the cloud. There's a lot more going on in Azure.
No, and Azure's been amazing. I've been on Azure for a couple years now.
They're not running Azure, by the way, but they're same idea.
It's been great though. I run my blog off Azure. WordPress works great with it. There's some mobile services that are available for you. There's a lot of attractive reasons why to be on Azure at this point. So we're going to get them involved. The kids are going to get an opportunity to set up their own Azure service and have their blog kind of through Azure.
Getting just cloud connected and building those robots and having the robot report data back up to the cloud is a really big deal and an extremely useful skill.
Cool. Well, Pete, thanks for taking a few minutes to be with us. Thanks for coming to Omaha. Always good to see you when you're here. And I want to thank you for watching this, and we'll have some more information about what's going on in the show notes for this broadcast. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
All right, let me stop.